Professor McCoy, thank you very much for joining our interview series. Let me start with the first question. In your study, you found that negative emotions such as anger and resentment can increase populist attitudes. Could you elaborate on the specific emotional triggers that are most effective in activating populist sentiments?
Yes. Negative attitudes generally are stronger than negative emotions are generally stronger than positive emotions, which makes it really difficult to combat them. But the negative emotions that populists often appeal to have to do with unfairness and injustice. And so they will talk about, a situation that is unfair or unjust, and that can create resentment and anger, sometimes also anxiety or fear, but anger and resentment are two that can cause people to look for someone to blame. And populists are good at identifying people to blame. And so they can identify an enemy, and that makes people feel somewhat in control. Now, populists can also draw on enthusiasm, and particularly enthusiasm about themselves, about the populist leader, and trust in the populist leader. But distrust in others is what becomes dangerous.
Right. In your research on democratic decline, what specific factors have you identified as the most critical in driving polarization in the United States and other democracies? What is the relationship between polarization and democratic decline? How are these two phenomena interrelated?
Yeah, well, we have found that looking at increases in what we call particularly extreme, toxic, or our term of pernicious polarization, which is when societies divide into two mutually distrustful and antagonistic camps. And they view politics as a win-lose game, that is a zero-sum game. That's when they feel threatened by having the other side in power. And they will do things or support politicians who will sometimes sacrifice democratic principles in order to gain power or stay in power. And so we see a relationship, at least a correlation, between rising political polarization toward extreme levels and declining scores of liberal democracy. That correlation, we think, may have this causal relationship that I described about the perceptions of people moving toward this perception of mutual existential threat from the other side, and therefore willing to sacrifice democracy.
Right. What are the root causes of polarization in the contemporary world, and how can we measure and compare its severity across different cases?
The kind of polarization that I'm talking about is very difficult to measure. There are more conventional terms that have been used, which is ideological polarization, which is measuring surveys of people, of individuals, their positions on issues, or their ideological position on a left-right scale or liberal-conservative scale, progressive-conservative scale. And then there's increasingly dominant in the literature is affective polarization, which is measuring feelings. How do people feel about other political parties, political leaders, and supporters of other political parties and political leaders? So how much dislike is there? What I think is very important is, as I mentioned before, the perception of threat. So it's not just dislike, but the perception of threat that people feel about another political camp. And this might be a political camp just led by a leader. So it might be pro and con leaders. So for example, in Venezuela, it was a great devotion to Hugo Chavez, who is a populist leader. And then those who were very much against him without necessarily being for another particular party. They were just against Chavez. And we see this in many countries in the world. In Hungary with Orban, in Turkey, perhaps with Erdogan. So it's not necessarily between two political parties. But what I'm talking about is looking at the national level, the systemic level, and it's a process of dividing society like this. And so a single measure is almost impossible to come up with. We have used varieties of democracy database, which asks experts in expert surveys their perception of their country of expertise, to what extent societies are divided into hostile camps. And so that gets close to what we're talking about. We've used that. We can look at levels of threat, as I said, in surveys among among voters. We can also look at the rhetoric that political leaders use. And this is really important because political leaders give cues to the voters. And as I said, particularly polarizing and populist leaders identify enemies, and they use a very divisive us versus them rhetoric. And so when we start to see leaders discrediting their opponents, calling them perhaps traitors to the country, disloyal to the country, not real citizens of that country, then that is a pretty clear sign of polarization as well, and a polarizing strategy used by the leaders.
You often refer to pernicious polarization as a threat to democracy and its role in fostering autocratization. How do you define pernicious polarization, and how does it differ from regular political polarization in a democratic society? What makes it particularly dangerous for democratic systems?
Yes, our definition of political polarization, as I mentioned, is the process of simplifying politics so that society becomes divided into us versus them, mutually distrustful and antagonistic political camps. And it is with this perception of a zero-sum game, that is a win-lose political game, and perceptions of mutual existential threat. Now, polarization, as often used by political scientists, can refer just to differentiation of political parties. And so if parties are saying, we're different from the others, vote for us because we're better at this than they are, just differentiating their camps. And if we see this difference growing, that is often a definition of polarization. You need some cues to voters about what political parties, what leaders stand for, and how they're different. So that's beneficial, that kind of differentiation and competition. It's when we move to this more toxic level that it becomes pernicious or harmful to democracy. And this is also our definition goes a little beyond affective polarization as well, because it's not just the feelings, it's not just the like and dislike, but it's actually this perception of threat and the zero-sum game that leads people to really break off the communication with other voters and members of society, and to stay in their own silo. So it's really breaking into this bifurcated camp, not only in their political identities, but in their social relationships.
Right. You argue that we have compelling historical reasons to worry about the pernicious consequences of polarization for democracy. Could you elaborate on these historical examples and their relevance?
Yes, we have seen societies divide. If you go back, and we've looked at episodes of pernicious polarization going back to 1900, so going back more than a century. And we've seen that many of these arise in situations in the interwar period in Europe, obviously the very us versus them kind of strategies of fascist leaders. We've seen it polarization rising as countries are trying to move to independence in the colonial world, before post-colonialism, so moving toward independence struggles, and in other kinds of conflict that might actually then result in civil war. So what we have seen is that in the past, when episodes of polarization are resolved, pernicious polarization like this have been resolved, it's been through these big systemic interruptions, either coming out of a war and arriving to a peace agreement, or coming out of a colonial to a post-colonial situation through independence struggles, or coming from a transition from authoritarianism to democracy. And so those kinds of solutions to high levels of polarization and conflict are big systemic interruptions, but we don't want that kind of solution today. We don't want war. We don't want transitions from authoritarianism. We already have independence. So what we're talking about are democracies, already existing democracies that are dividing in this way and finding that their governance is threatened, their ability to compromise, to negotiate, to work together to solve problems, collective problems, as democratic politics should do, is being hampered and impeded by this level of extreme polarization. So we're looking for solutions to overcome it that do not resort to those extreme systemic interruptions we've seen in the past.
Right. Once the harmful form of polarization takes root, how can it be avoided or reversed? What strategies or institutional reforms do you believe are most effective in mitigating polarization and restoring democratic stability in deeply divided societies?
Yes, this is the really difficult question to answer. And I'm working on research with Murat Somer from Turkey on this. We're working on a book right now on this, trying to look at historic examples. What have countries done to be able to overcome this? That countries that have been democracies, and experienced it. We do not have good examples of democracies from the past, of established democracies who have gone through this, who have reached these levels of polarization and come out of it, in peaceful ways. So we don't have very good examples, but we have some instances. So there are several principles that we identify that need to be done. So if you think of first of polarization as what this division of society, simplifying politics into two, an us versus them camp, is eliminating those cross-cutting ties that are so important in democracies when people have different identities and can identify with other people based on those different identities and interests, despite their political views. With extreme polarization, people's social identities and their patterns of social interactions also begin to be reinforced and align with their political identities. And so they lose those cross-cutting ties to interact with people from other political camps. So we need to restore those cross-cutting ties. We need to find spaces to bring people together. And there's a lot of work done on this in terms of bridging, of bringing people together to work on projects at the local level is one really good way, in their neighborhood, working together, getting people to know one another first as in a social relationship, see their shared humanity, their concern, for example, about the safety of their children. How can we increase safety of their children, well-being, and then begin to discuss politics and political solutions. But a second way is we need to look at how can we move from these zero-sum perceptions to positive win-win perceptions of politics, of economic problems. And this, entails a lot of things. It entails information and the way the media reports on things. And so if we have media, for example, it's very common in the United States, media is really focusing on the current election in the US, focusing on the horse race and treating, the candidates, trying to create a balance in their treatment of them, while we have one candidate who actually threatened democracy by refusing to recognize the results of the last election. And by just focusing on the competition, the horse race, the conflict, without focusing on real policy solutions, proposals, what it means for people, how different kinds of positive news and accomplishments can bring a win-win to everybody, then people lose sight of that, or they're not aware of that. And the third thing I want to mention is changing incentives, changing the incentives for politicians, especially, but also for voters, to engage in this polarizing strategy. Politicians know that appealing to anger, resentment, unfairness with this divisive, blaming kind of rhetoric can be a very winning electoral strategy. And they need to know that also appealing to more positive emotions, that looking to the future, providing a vision of hope and enthusiasm can also be a winning strategy. So looking at and amplifying examples of that, as I would say, happened recently in Turkey in local elections. And changing the incentives for politicians also can mean changing electoral institutions. So particularly in the former British colonies, so we have Britain, Canada, the United States, India, with winner-take-all electoral majoritarian systems that are, emphasize single-member districts, which are winner-take-all districts for the legislature. And this creates a disproportionate representation for the larger party or parties, makes it very difficult. So it's disproportionate. And so unlike most of Europe, most of Latin America that uses proportional representation, where parties are getting representation based on the actual share of votes, in these systems, a larger party, or in the United States, it helps to reinforce the two-party system. It's very hard for third parties, fourth parties to break in, for other voices to break in and have a voice. So changing, and so that kind of incentive, the winner take all, incentivizes politicians to just go to turn out their own base to win, instead of broadening out and trying to appeal to larger groups of people, because they don't have to form coalitions. It's a two-party system. All they have to do is turn out their own base, which they can do with these very negative, polarizing appeals.
In an article, you mentioned that polarization can sometimes contribute to democratic deepening under certain conditions. Can you explain the mechanisms by which polarization might strengthen democracy, and what factors differentiate constructive polarization from destructive polarization?
Yeah, there's two ways that I want to mention. One is simply building political party identity, which does require this differentiation. So here I'm talking about polarization simply as the differentiation of political parties, not this extreme or pernicious level that we were talking about. So Adrian Labas, for example, focuses on cases in Africa where it's actually this kind of focus on differentiation helps to build and mobilize citizens in new parties that can challenge and contest, a long time dominant party, and that you need that kind of identification to mobilize people. So it can be positive in that sense. But we also are arguing in our research, Somer and I, that what we call constructive polarization or transformative repolarization can be when a country is already perniciously polarized and it's around some dividing line that a polarizing leader has identified, whether that's, immigration, whether that's just, the people versus the elites, that challenging leaders and parties can try to change the axis of polarization. There are many axes. Another might be religious versus secular contest, urban versus rural. In Europe, often it's nationalism, national versus more cosmopolitan, let's say EU versus the nation, in Hungary, or versus Russia. So in changing a line, the axis of polarization, one of the things we've seen is democracy versus authoritarianism. So if a country is backsliding its democracy, sliding into autocracy, then identifying a new dividing line, a new cleavage, and identifying the values of democracy, of integrity, of non-corruption, then this can be, and identifying the dangers of an authoritarian trend, as long as it focuses on the values and the ideas, rather than demonizing individuals and demonizing voters who might support a democratic backslider. If it focuses on the ideas, that can be constructive. So correcting democratic deficits as the focus, or correcting social injustices. We saw that with the civil rights movement in the United States, correcting racial injustice. The focus can be on simply, we need to be more inclusive. We need to erase this discrimination, this subordination of particular races, and make equality and inclusion the focus. So that kind of transformative repolarization can actually help to strengthen democracy and correct these injustices.
Right. How do you explain the rise of far-right parties in Europe, particularly in some of the most developed democracies? Why do citizens in seemingly advanced political systems feel powerless and turn to support far-right populist parties?
Well, I think there was a convergence of parties in the 1990s and 2000s, early 2000s, toward market solutions, market economic solutions. Globalization was rising. Many people were left behind, and people didn't feel that the political parties were necessarily responsive. In Europe in particular, the social democratic parties started to lose their anchoring in society, particularly in labor unions. In the United States, labor unions have been, decimated, are only now beginning to recover in incipient ways. And so without that strong anchoring and programmatic vision in the society, particularly on the left, I think that people felt like the parties were the same. There was no choice, and they were unresponsive to the needs of people who were feeling left out of the globalization. We also have broad other kinds of global systemic changes happening. Of course, we have the technological change, which also implies automation of jobs, affecting a lot of people, as well as the information technologies affecting the way people receive their information, their news, and their political messaging. And then, of course, we've had climate change and the effects on movements of people. We've had wars, civil wars in some cases. So we've had big movements of people, immigrants, refugees around the world. All of these things have been converging on top of the 2008-2010 financial crisis, global crisis, and converging. And the political systems have just had, difficulty responding, and the traditional political parties. And that opens the door for both outsider populist leaders and for far-right parties to come in, again, with their blaming rhetoric and identifying an enemy to blame for these problems, and identifying enemies that need to be eliminated, which tends to be mostly in Europe very, very strongly an anti-immigrant message, but it can be others as well.
What role did polarization play in Donald Trump's victory in 2016? Could you elaborate on how polarization contributed to Trump's appeal among American voters?
Yes, many of these same factors were at play in the US. Both the strong convergence of the Democratic and Republican parties around globalization measures without sufficient compensation to workers who would be hurt and to industries that would be hurt as change was occurring in the 1990s and early 2000s. But polarization in the United States has been rising for several decades. So it goes back in time to long time unresolved debates in American history. One of those is racial, the racial divide, and the notion of inclusive and equal citizenship that goes back to the founding of the nation when slavery was legal, of course, and African enslaved peoples were not considered fully human beings. Women, of course, were second-class citizens. Indigenous Native Americans were not included. So we have these long resolved debates. As the country over the last 200 years has tried to address these injustices and be more inclusive, we've gone through a lot of tumultuous cycles. Of course, we went through the Civil War in 1860, but even since then, coming up to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s, the women's movement in the 1970s was disruptive. And this is part of this disruptive or transformative polarization I said can be useful. It's needed, but it is disruptive and it creates backlash. Every time a democracy moves forward to be more inclusive, include new groups that have been left out or newly emerging groups, also the LGBTQ movement trying to demand more, say, different minority groups in different countries. But in the United States, in particular, this has been growing really since the civil rights movements in the 1960s, when dominant white groups and men in particular have felt, threatened their own identity, their own positions as leaders in the community, as leaders in the economy, as providers for their families. So on top of this, we had the change in media and communication technology, cable news opening up, all kinds of opinion news, radio, talk radio, and then social media really proliferating sources of information that people could turn to. And then we had a strategy from the Republican Party going back to the 1990s of this very confrontational politics that was polarizing as an intentional political strategy. All of these things were building to Donald Trump arriving in 2016 and sensing this. He could sense this in the population, I think, and underlying grievances, people still reeling from the financial crisis, and all of these changes and demands for new rights coming, which is good for democracy. That should happen. But he sensed this, and he could naturally use, his instinct is to use a more bullying strategy and a blaming strategy. And he could draw people to him as identifying enemies, getting rid of political correctness. And people were drawn to that, being, kind of tired of having to be careful about how they identified somebody else or what they said. And he really just galvanized a lot of these underlying anxieties. And of course, claimed to be an outsider, a successful businessman that people looked up to, and that he would come in and, save the economy, save the democracy. He blamed also, he had a strong anti-immigrant appeal. But we have to keep in mind that he did not win the majority of votes. Hillary Clinton won the majority of votes. Again, we have this unique system in the United States of a democracy that has an indirect presidential election with our electoral college and our Senate, and a very disproportionate system of election, so that some areas have, and now more rural areas have more weight in our system than urban, and those rural areas have tended with our polarization and are sorting to become more Republican, and that also helped Donald Trump.
How do you think American democracy and its institutions will respond to another Trump administration if he wins the election on November the 5th? Some scholars and institutions argue that American democracy may not survive another Trump term. Where do you stand on this debate?
I am concerned. I'm on the concerned side of the debate. I don't think the democracy will fail completely, but I think it can be damaged and can become extremely unstable. And the main concern is the first time he came in, Trump was not prepared. He didn't really expect to win. He wasn't prepared. He didn't, have people to bring in to support him. There were a lot of still institutional guardrails that could stop him at different points. Since then, we had, and during his 4 years, he was able, one, to make a lot of judicial appointments. So courts were used a lot during his first term, and Democrats resorted to lawsuits a lot to stop many of his kind of autocratic tendencies. And now the courts are, politicized to I think a significant degree and kind of divided. And so in the United States, for some things you can kind of choose which court or which district to go to. And so some courts are known to be much more conservative than others. So that's a problem. And of course, the Supreme Court, he was able to dominate a lot through a lot of, really pushing the limits on constitutional legality on being able to name 3 Supreme Court justices. So those are weakened, I would say, those guardrails. But more importantly, he's had time, and his supporters and people who want to kind of use his presidency for their own agendas have had time to prepare. And they've had time to prepare legal memoranda about how he could assert even more executive power than our president already has. A lot of executive power, but even more, and put in loyalists into important positions throughout the federal government and the bureaucracy. And so change the kind of guardrails from the civil service. So I really do worry about that. And then we also have our states are very divided, Republican dominated states. Really, there are more Republican dominated states than Democrats, but cases where on both sides, all of the levers of the state government are controlled by one party or the other. So we have a lot of areas that what used to be more institutional guardrails are weakening, and we have a population that will be very divided, depending on whether he wins or loses. It will be very divided because people now are kind of entrenched in their positions. A lot of people, not everyone. I mean, it's about 30%, I would say, really entrenched in their support for Trump. And, maybe another 30% really on the Democratic side. And we have a large group in the middle, some 40% that claim to be unidentified, though they lean one way or the other. But with those that are very strong supporters of Trump and may react if he loses, may react very negatively, we have, a problem there. And surveys have shown, and researchers have shown, maybe 10% support the idea of political violence for an election loss, which he will, most likely say is a rigged election if he loses. And then if he wins, of course, people who oppose him and Democrats will be doing all they can to, I don't think they'll be such, resort to violence, but will be doing all they can to try to stop any further curtailment of rights that he might try to do.
And lastly, Professor McCoy, if Trump wins the election on November the 5th, how do you think this victory will impact the populist movements worldwide?
Well, I think it'll embolden them because he will support them. He won't, try to support or reinforce democracy in those areas where they may be trying to concentrate power and erode democracy. I think it'll support, it'll embolden the authoritarian regimes in Russia, in China. He will try to stand up to China. He does have a strong anti-China, rhetoric, but not with Putin and Russia. So, yeah, I think it will embolden them.
Professor McCoy, thank you so very much. Appreciate your time.
Thank you.